So we're back after a brief intermission, and before continuing on to ecological degradation and stuff like that, I just want to bring up one thing regarding economics that I feel should mention that I forgot earlier. Company towns basically ruined local economies as well, because miners didn't get paid in real money. Which meant that they had no money to spend at normal stores in normal communities. So the entire system of company towns, it wasn't just bad for the miners living in those company towns. It was kind of devastating for the local economy as a whole as well. And that's important to remember, I think, talking about the situation today. Like the reason for the poor economic state of the region is basically that they historically never had a chance to establish like local economic institutions.
Very good.
So I just wanted to
yeah, that's very important. Yeah, good.
Do you want to say anything about the ecological toll of coal mining?
I was hoping you would know. Yeah, well, I can start off, and then you can you can expand on that, because it is something which I've been interested in. Again, it goes back to my my childhood and my trips through southern Ohio, and my dad's propensity to go off the beaten track. Which was always fun on family vacations when we would travel from Ohio down to Florida. And there's something called the Automobile Club, and they would, this is before computers, of course, but they would make a triptych, it was called. They would map off your whole journey from start to finish, and then you get a big folder, and it was set out, you know, where you could go and where you could stay and all the rest of it. My dad that was the starting point, but then we would deviate, much to the dismay of my mother and my brother, but I thought it was fascinating. So, and if he hadn't done that, and he even did that when we were traveling by car in Cleveland, we would go off the beaten track. So I remember, for example, poverty-stricken areas of Georgia. And I thought these were pictures like from the 19th century, and the red clay and shacks that people were still living in. This is in the 1960s. Terribly, I wouldn't never have been encountered that sort of reality if my dad hadn't done that. And I think it probably had reflected a bit on his own upbringing. It never really left him. But one thing I remembered, and this does have to do with ecological degradation, was on one of our trips, either to or from Bethany College in West Virginia, traveling through southern Ohio. And I noticed that this, I can only describe it, it looked like a moonscape. Maybe that's not, but it was just this, it was a barren landscape. It was such a contrast to the rest of nature in southern Ohio, and it was like sort of rolling hills, but it was like these ravines and stuff were dug deep into them, and nothing was really growing there. There weren't any trees. It's just sort of ground vegetation. And I asked my father, well, you know, what happened here? And so this is the effect of strip mining. And I had never even heard the term before. And he explained was because after they got all the, you know, doing the deep mining that you were talking about earlier, and not wanting to lose any profits, well, if we can't get the coal down deep in the earth, maybe we can get it some other way. And they found that in some, for example, in southern Ohio, coal was pretty close to the surface. So they just strip mining was stripping the soil off, the topsoil, which is rather important if you're going to grow something. They stripped it off and dug down a bit, and they extracted more. So they keep the mining industry going even longer. And it's quite horrible. This is in the 1960s, and strip mining he was talking about, I think, took place in the 1920s or something. And the area just hadn't hadn't recovered. And then looking more recently, and something you can talk more about, is something called mountaintop removal, because that was the next step. But before we talk about that, so again, it's not only were people, you know, ripped off and they didn't have any private lives and any private savings or anything else, and the company towns controlled everything, but this destroyed the environment as well. And I mean, it's okay, deep mining is one thing, but when you start doing strip mining and then what is called euphemistically mountaintop removal, it's like you just sort of cut off the top. It was another way of getting to the coal that hadn't been got at before. But I just want to mention two books on the recommended reading list. One of them is from the 1950s. It's called, sorry, 1960s. It's called The Other America by Michael Harrington. And hopefully it's in print. Otherwise, try to get a hold of it some other way. And it's been called the book that sparked the war on poverty. And what Michael Harrington did was he traveled through different parts of America, and he wanted to show how, as opposed to the 1930s, poverty had become invisible. Because the 60s are a very prosperous time in America. And Galbraith Kenneth Galbraith had written a popular book showing the prosperity of America. Actually, he talked about poverty as well, but that people didn't read that part, I guess. But Harrington, who was a social worker, Catholic socialist, something in New York, he says, no, actually poverty, we're worse off today because the poverty that exists, and it's a lot, is invisible. People don't see it, don't think about it. And you can see this in cities, and you can see it especially in Appalachia. Because, as you talked about earlier, it's a very beautiful, it is fantastically beautiful region. But people say, well, this is beautiful, we drive through it, but they don't see the suffering. Yeah. But thinking about the book today, was reprinted in the 1980s when Reagan was president, timely reprinting. Harrington unfortunately died at a young age. But thinking about it now, I haven't reread it, but I taught it for so many years. You could read it today. The figures are different, probably worse in many ways. And certainly the inequalities in America, economic inequalities, are much greater than they were in the 1960s. And you can read it today, and it's really a discussion, change the figures around, but it's a very good introduction to American society today. So he writes about Appalachia in the 1960s, but then there's another book which was published in 2006 by somebody called Erik Reece, R-E-E-C-E, and it's called Lost Mountain. So another one of these place names, Harlan County, Blair Mountain. Lost Mountain, I think, was actually the name of the mountain, was a victim of mountaintop removal. And he goes into great detail about the enormous ecological degradation and how it's affected people's lives in America. And both Harrington and Reece come up with their own alternatives 20 years apart, 40 years apart, about what could be done in this region. So yeah, strip mining in the 1920s, generally speaking, and then mountaintop removal, which I forget when it started, maybe in the 90s or beginning around 2000. But maybe you could say something more about this mountaintop removal, because again, it says something about the way people with power and money have treated very nice people. We're talking about populism again, you know, people who are actually living in this area. So yeah. Would you like to say more about that?
Yeah, I'll just say that what you said about moonscape earlier, it's really like spot on. It's what it means is basically blowing up the entire mountain to get at the coal seams within, and then taking the rubble from blasting and dumping it in the hollers around.
Thank
and
you. You can
ruining
explain
them
that
as well.
later.
So yeah, it basically like levels out the landscape, and Appalachia if anything, it's famous for like beautiful mountains and beautiful mountain valleys
Right.
with wonderful little streams running through them. And what mountaintop removal basically does, it lowers the mountains up to 200 meters, and it fills up the valleys up to 200 meters. So there's like a total leveling effect of about 400 meters. And aside from like the purely cosmetic aspect of it, it also poisons the ground because of the chemicals used in mining.
Right.
Like normally, Appalachian soil, at least in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, is very rich in clay, fairly compact, which means that water runs over it into the mountain streams and continues into larger streams. And one of the major problems, at least one of the major long-term problems with mountaintop removal is the rubble left over from blasting or not used, the stuff that's dumped in the hollows. It soaks up the streams, the water running down the mountains, and water gets trapped, and this basically just kills the mountain streams completely. And in cases where mountain streams continue to flow, they usually pick up, worst case scenario, a lot of acids from mine operations, which kills all vegetation and most animal life, and probably lots of people downstream. And best case scenario, the streams are like severely alkaline, because people try to counteract the acids by dumping other chemicals into the streams. That's where you get the famous red or orange mountain streams, which are also toxic, not quite as toxic as the acidic mountain streams, but still toxic, and still like severely detrimental to plant and animal life. So it's just like ecological damage on a scale that's like it's hard to imagine
exactly
something like that happening to the place where I live. Just like complete ecological devastation. And I'd recommend people going to Google Earth and zooming in on southern West Virginia and the very easternmost part of Kentucky.
Right.
You can see it from space, basically, just like
of course,
giant open source in the landscape. And even when you zoom in, you can see that, like you said, there is some vegetation in places, but all the trees are gone. It's just like scrub and sparse grass. And if you contrast it with the beautiful mountains and like the heavily wooded mountains that are normal for the region, it's I mean it's a striking contrast, to say the least.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking, well, like in Reece's book, he has black and white photographs. And I was also thinking, I mean, yeah, one can have a PowerPoint thing perhaps, but, you know, showing images of this, I was just thinking in terms of individual pictures, but yeah, Google Earth, I didn't even think of that. That's an excellent way to, and again, just not the specific damage, but also you say the extent of it is completely unimaginable. And looking at Reece's black and white pictures, even also, I mean, how do you capture that? But Google Earth, that's fantastic, because you see the untouched areas around. But no, it's just amazing that I was trying to think of. You say you couldn't think of, you know, something like that happen here. Is there any? I mean, it's a totally different geology and landscape and everything. Or could one make a possible comparison to something like, I don't know, taking down a mountain in Småland, or I don't.
There is actually a mining project up in the north of Sweden. That's it's still in the planning stage, but it's basically the same thing. They're gonna blow up a mountain to get at I think it's either iron or copper. It's, Sweden, because of like the geology, Sweden has basically no coal at all,
Right.
but we have lots of other minerals,
Right.
mainly iron.
Right.
And there's like a political fight at the moment because the plan is basically the same. They're going to blow up a mountain, mine it, and dump the rubble into a valley. Local,
you know, like science fiction. Who comes up with, you know, some mad scientist who? I'm glad you pointed that out. It's not just you know, explode part of a mountain, but you actually fill in the valley with rubble. I mean, just stopping there for a second. Who would come up with such a stupid? No, I mean. So really,
yeah,
this is shocking. I didn't know this.
It's insane.
I'm glad I learned something about Sweden.
No, it's, and like this is far from where I live, so I'm probably never gonna see the effects.
No.
Let's say take a trip up north, but it's tragic, and especially like I said, when you look at the satellite images on Google Earth, you can really see like the scale of the devastation. It's something like 7% of the like affected area has been completely ruined, and it's damage that's pretty much unrepairable. It's going to be this way for like millions of years. And it's I don't know, tragic is the right word for it, I guess.
Yeah, it's I would think of a stronger word, and also, like say, it's Eastern Kentucky. I think that's where Lost Mountain was, and he lived and he interviewed people there. Yeah, I remember The Color of the River. I haven't reread his book in ages, but it's starting to come back to me. But he talked to people there, and also the resistance against this, and that didn't work too well. Again, you have the same enemies as before, so how much has really changed? And the environmental, the EPA, that I remember, was sort of on the side of, this is before Trump, but really on the side of the miners. They did nothing. They were the federal agency that should have stopped this, and they did nothing at all. But as you 7%, which maybe doesn't sound like much, but Eastern Kentucky, if you look at a map, Eastern Kentucky and Southern West Virginia, in the context of even just the Eastern United States, it's not an enormous area. And this is a relatively small area. You take 7% of that, and 7% of the specific area of Eastern Kentucky and then West Virginia that's in Appalachia, and then think about the direct effect on people living there, because people actually do live there in the hollers. I love that. And but beyond that too, I mean, Appalachia, it's not just the mountains, it sort of spills out, and
yeah, that's
that's tragic.
Another thing, the problem spilling out, like 7%, that's just the area that's
Right.
like immediately destroyed. It affects headwaters of rivers in a much greater area. So the knock-on effects from water pollution, that's I mean, that's probably all of the region, to be honest. And that's probably even more important, because like clean drinking water, that's kind of important for people to live, and animals and plants. So
no, it's completely devastated the environment, and again, talking about the immediate areas which Reece deals with and talking to people there. And again, we come back to this fact that these are isolated areas. People live in small communities, cut off from the next valley, the next holler, and which in many ways can be nice, and it can further social structure. But it means that when your town, your village, your community doesn't have any drinking water, I mean, that's it. You know, it has to be brought in by, I don't know what you do. So he interviews
Like,
people whose lives have been completely devastated by this.
if
And
you
then
don't have the capital to put up a water treatment plant, or
yeah, which would be nice.
yeah, I mean, if you can't solve the problem that way, then
Yeah,
you're left without
right.
any means of survival, I guess.
No, and
And
in
it's
2006, and maybe things are done, but he also talks about how reclamation projects that the company took up, and it becomes more absurd. But I
yeah,
don't remember reading anything about water reclamation projects. It would have been nice if they had done that, but instead, one thing I remember, no, not going to believe it, but it is science fiction, but it is in the book. So you have this flat area, what used to be a mountain top. Well, you sow some grass on it. And of course, that's what we wrote. Now we'll have some trees that are not native to the area. And then you know what you can do and attract investors? This would be something for Donald Trump. You can build a golf course. I mean, why didn't anybody think about this? And
uh,
people were so-called investors were doing reclamations, you know, because you were supposed to reclaim the area after you did this. Yeah, well, good luck with that. So there were actually, you know, people who did that, and surprisingly, they failed. I think, and I might be wrong because my memory is affected by COVID. No, but I think he also talks about, you know, like deer and stuff taking over. Which sort of a nice Gary Larson touch to it. The animals reclaim the golf course or something. But yeah, water purification, that would seem to be the most obvious thing to put in. I forget the name of the village where he is. That would be,
yeah.
but that didn't seem to happen.
No, the problem is, and like this is the same problem that you have in other industrially ravaged places like Flint, for example. Like the people living there don't have the means to
Yeah.
solve problems of this magnitude. If you live in a small town in Appalachia, you probably don't have enough money to build water money to move elsewhere
Yeah.
if you don't. And it's the same thing with the people living in Flint. Like you can't move, you're stuck there. There's no clean drinking water, and you don't have the millions and millions and millions of dollars needed to come up with a technical solution to the
No.
problem. So you're stuck drinking poisonous water. And I mean, it's unconscionable. And this is something like later on, when we're talking about the situation today and the war on poverty and stuff like that. It's a region that it's treated in the same way as like the people there are treated the same way marginalized groups elsewhere are treated. And the land itself is treated basically the same way Western companies and Western governments treat third world countries.
Exactly.
There's no regard at all for
No.
the nature or the people living there.
Yeah.
It's I mean, it's almost like a third world colony within America, or at least it's
Definitely.
treated that way,
Right.
and it shouldn't be. I mean,
Yeah.
it's incredibly unfair,
Yeah.
and like one, as we alluded to at the start of part one, when people start blaming Appalachians for social problems in America at large, I mean, maybe take a look at your own actions throughout history aimed at these people and ask yourself, is there is there possibly a good reason for people being angry?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't blame people for being discontent when stuff like mountaintop removal goes on
Yeah.
where people live. It's completely understandable.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point, and this might be something I'll talk to you afterwards. We can deal with next time, but making the link between what happens environmentally and socially and in human terms in places like, well, talk about Nigeria and oil, but any place where, or in India, I'm thinking about, where a power plant is built or dam, what total disregard for the people living there.
Yeah.
A very, very important link to make. So this is happening, or in South America, and also the number of environmental activists who have been killed for defending water rights and land rights and so forth. But this is part of global capitalism. Sounds like a pamphlet now, but I mean, it's very interesting. It's very important to see these links, and that again, Appalachia, this isolated regional inbred people, no, these are things that are happening in similar areas throughout the world. And
Yeah.
yeah, just to emphasize that.
Yeah, it's the part of the curse of having rich natural
Exactly.
resources. Because what usually happens when you do is capital moves in, extracts
Yeah,
everything of value, and then moves out,
and
taking the
leaves.
profits with it. And this is what's happened in Appalachia.
Yeah,
The people living there aren't the one who made money off of coal mining. The people who made that money, they all came from New York and Pennsylvania
right.
and places like that. So, I mean, it's people have a cause for bitterness, I think, and to be frank, are right to be kind of bitter.
Yeah. And then also one of the points that Harrington made in the 60s, which he still made today, because he compares things to the 30s. He said things were, okay, was more widespread, poverty and everything, but like everybody was, affected by unemployment and poverty. But there's a sense of solidarity. And also the other ingredient he points to is there was a political party, FDR, the Democrats, the New Deal, that said, we're going to do something about this. And we're going to fight on the side of the working man and the working woman. And he finds that lacking in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Then we have the War on Poverty, LBJ, which is a sort of mini, I would call it a New Deal. Well, yeah, an attempt to some extent successful, an attempt by the federal government, at least an attempt for the federal government to get involved in trying to solve poverty. It was never as extensive as the New Deal. But then after the so-called war on poverty in the late 60s, going forward in history, we haven't reached that point yet. And the thing about a political party, standing on the side of the people working there, so it makes the situation more difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, it's easier if everybody is in the same boat, I guess.
Oh, exactly. So it is, but I thought it was rather, because then the 80s happened and Reagan said, we're going back to free enterprise and everything. But maybe we could say something briefly about the New Deal. I was thinking about the TVA, and then what happened, the war on poverty, and especially West Virginia, and then go on to a big thing about the situation today, but just touch upon. Because when I think about the New Deal, I think about and investments in Appalachia, I think about the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. I don't know, is there something that you think about or?
Yeah, well, for obvious reasons, the thing I mainly think about is the Wagner Act.
Okay, yeah, definitely.
Like the National Industrial Recovery Act,
Yes.
a few years earlier, 1933,
Yeah.
gave workers some protections, like protections for organizing and collective bargaining and stuff. But most of the provisions in that bill were struck down by the Supreme Court. Then in 1935, the Wagner Act basically redid the relationship between capital and labor entirely, and was a huge boost to unions in America.
Right.
And one of the main things was it banned yellow unions, like company controlled unions,
Right.
and guaranteed the right to strike and collectively bargain and stuff like that. Basically everything that the miners from 1880 up until that point in time had been demanding.
Right.
So like in one fell swoop, FDR stepped in and just gave them everything they'd been fighting for, which is like a win.
Right.
And this is a product of the shift towards political advocacy rather than like armed insurrection.
Nice. But
So,
also, I mean, the Wagner Act is, I mean, it lays the foundation for labor rights in America, and we haven't gone beyond that. So again, when we talked about unions trying to organize in Amazon, I mean, the next step is to, and there are proposals by Biden, I forget the names now, but to strengthen the right for unions to organize. But so the Wagner Act, okay, this is in the 1930s, but it's enormously relevant to today. And that was a long time ago. I mean, when I was growing up, the 30s weren't all that distant history, but that's almost like 100 years ago. So it has topical importance today, doesn't it, to strengthen?
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, because the first decade after passing the Wagner Act, the Republicans did everything they could to weaken or or repeal it, basically. But it's still on the books, and the PRO Act, Biden's,
that's it.
not Biden's, came about before, but the effort to pass the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act,
right?
That's basically just building on the Wagner Act, expanding it and making some adjustments. So it's highly relevant today. I mean, it's still the bulk of the legislation concerning like labor rights in America.
Okay.
But then, of course, as you mentioned, the Tennessee River Valley. That's speaking of displacing people.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you'll bring up all the bad things. No, it was massive investment. No, but you're definitely right. It's just that, yeah, maybe talk about this. Yeah, this enormous investment in trying to desperately think of something positive to say. But yeah, providing water power throughout the region and so forth. I'll just end with one visual thing, and it's actually, this is not in favor of, but it's one of the few places, if you're traveling by plane across America, it's one of the, I think, 3 areas that at least before airplane captains would ask you to look down and see. One of them is the Grand Canyon, the other Rocky Mountains, and the third one is the TVA. And especially at night, sorry about it. So again, the extent of it, but it's quite beautiful from the air, the lakes and everything. But maybe you could give a more balanced picture of.
Well, the TVA did some good as well. Like, that's important to mention, I think. For anybody who isn't familiar with it, the TVA stands for Tennessee Valley Authority, which was this organization that was basically put in charge of modernizing and reforming the economy of southern Appalachia, mainly, I think. And what they did, like the main thing, was they planted a lot of trees A lot of reforestation to prevent soil erosion and stuff like that. And they built a lot of dams, hydroelectric dams.
Right.
And the good thing about that is you get hydroelectric electric power, which is clean and doesn't doesn't depend on setting coal on fire
No.
to be able to light your light bulbs and whatever. The bad thing is they flooded a bunch of valleys, and everybody living there, like thousands of homes, were just flooded and people displaced. And it's, I mean, it's hard to say whether it's worth it, but it's typical of the government's approach to the region.
Yes, the problem, well, I think there's two problems. One of them carries over in general economic development. One, you have the federal government doing something, which can be good because suddenly, again, like the New Deal, the federal government is going to go in there. We're going to change people's lives. But it tends to create a bureaucracy that is out of touch with the people actually living there, which I think was true, even though you, like the economics professor I never had, he was an idealist. He wanted to change things, and he had the intellectual skills to, and he believed in the project. And you do have different projects taking place. The other problem I have with this, and this comes into what we can do more today, is these regional programs, how successful they actually are, and to what extent a regional program would be successful in Appalachia. And indeed, what would that regional development look like when you cut off, make something a region, say, it's in Spain, also the north of Sweden, say, we're going to develop this region. And I think there can be certain problems in that. But I think it's important to just to remember the federal government did try to do something and establish this commission. And the commission still exists today, which is, I find quite amazing. I didn't know it still existed. And maybe you could say something about what is it doing today? And are there any important people sitting on the board that we should know about?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked.
Are you glad?
Just what is it, like 2.5 weeks ago, the Appalachian Regional
Commission
got a new federal co-chair, like the highest governing body of the ARC. Is made up of the senators of the 13 Appalachian states and a federal representative called the federal co-chair. And since about May 6th, that's Gail Manchin, the wife of...
The last name sounds familiar.
Yeah, wife of our old friend, Senator Manchin, West Virginia. So I don't know what to make of that, but I mean, good luck to her in her new job, and hope she delivers.
I'm not sure what the commission does anymore, but again, I didn't really look into it.
It funds a lot of like education efforts and stuff like that, and it's involved in tons of, like, we spoke about this before we started recording. I was whining and complaining as usual because the focus of the ARC at the present is on public-private partnerships, which I see as like the main problem with the whole thing. Public-private partnerships, I mean, they can do good stuff, but one of the problems is it extracts fees from people using services set up through these projects, and that removes money and capital from the region. I would prefer just direct investments in local projects, basically just direct payments and grants. That way you could focus less on trying to keep costs low to satisfy private businesses, and just hire local contractors, use local resources, and focus on providing jobs and keeping the money in the region instead.
Right.
Because like historically, that's the problem, capital flight, and profits not being shared with the people of the region. So I mean, I have problems with the way they're doing business, but at the same time, they do some good stuff. And it's nice that someone tries to do something about the problems in Appalachia.
Perhaps we could talk about what, I mean, you started to talk about it. What could be done? What would be beneficial for, or what can, what would be good to do in Appalachia, or people, how can one solve some of these problems? I mean, you've really started to talk about it, local investment, and but maybe you could explain a bit more.
Well, during the New Deal, a lot of money was spent on direct payments, just put money in people's pockets so they can buy stuff. Same approach as the COVID relief bill. Just give people money so they can buy stuff and directly stimulate the economy. I think that's probably a good idea. Just some kind of direct payments. And also back in the 30s, you had work relief programs. That might be a good idea as well. Just federal funds going to pay workers for doing stuff that needs to be done. There's all kinds of stuff that needs to be done. Like you could start trying to sanitize the ecological devastation, for example.
Exactly.
Using local labor. Just put money in people's pockets and give people access to capital so they can start businesses themselves. Instead of relying on outside busineses to move in and start like franchises and stuff like that. I don't know. It's hard to say beyond that. Like more money for education, free healthcare would be nice.
I was going to say health services, and
so money isn't extracted from people going to out-of-state insurance companies and stuff like that.
Yeah, some of the things I think would benefit people outside of Appalachia. But I think that's very important. The local thing, that's sometimes, maybe that's part of my criticism, regional development. It tends to be a top-down sort of thing. And I think local investment is very important. And then you can use certainly government money for education, to improve schools, to say some sort of public works thing where, again, the federal government, there's money available to, there's no limit to the amount of work that could be put into cleaning up the environment, and so people have clean water, and just like in Flint, Michigan, with the lead pipes and everything. This is another problem in Appalachia. So federal money could be used more sensibly, and it's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but looking back to some of the programs of the 1930s of the New Deal, that's quite interesting. And then also very interesting, as you said, we're giving direct payments to people as part of COVID relief, and nobody's rebelling. Well, Republicans are rebelling against that, but we're seeing how useful this is. Unfortunately, I just saw recently some of the unemployment benefits, the states are going to stop paying them, and then the federal money is going to run out. So you have this crazy situation. But I mean, use some of the measures, some of the financing that was put into the COVID relief bill, and was earmark it for projects in Appalachia, because this does not take away from people's initiative. On the contrary, it actually means you can actually change your life.
It
And
makes it possible to actually take initiative.
exactly, yeah,
If you have the means to put
exactly,
something in motion, then you can
yeah,
actually do something about your situation
right,
instead of being stuck in hopeless poverty.
exactly, yeah.
Uh,
Because I think there is, again, this stereotype, well, you know, they're stuck in poverty, they can't do anything about it. And as also, as I mentioned, just as I remember before we started to record, when I was reading about COVID relief in Appalachia, different health reports. And one of the things that health workers pointed to as being a benefit, I mean, you have poverty, you have everything else, but one of the things that facilitated COVID relief actions or health actions was, as they said, the strong social structure in these relatively isolated communities, which I thought was brilliant and also a testimony to how people have survived everything that we've talked about up until now, because you would think that there is no social structure whatsoever. It's also something which is very prominent in Reece's book, Lost Mountain. But to use this, so if you already have that there, then you have something to build on, and people do want to change their lives. It's just if you don't have the money or the means to do so, then it's Oxycontin, you know, hillbilly heroin.
yeah.
So you can attack those problems as well. So there's something to build on that quite often people outside of Appalachia who are not working there don't realize.
Yeah, and also it's a question of economic justice, I
Yes,
think,
definitely.
because like it's another parallel to the situation of African Americans.
Mhm.
Like we're talking about a group of people who have been exploited quite
Right.
brutally historically, and uh, they're still living in conditions that are much worse than the majority population. And they have played an important part in building the American economy,
Right.
and we should be compensated for it.
Right.
Like I don't think direct payments should even be seen as welfare. It should be seen
No,
as like restitution,
yeah,
basically.
exactly.
And I think that's also the like one of the problems is the general idea that welfare recipients are leeches
Right.
who are like living off of the labor of others. It's like going back to Reagan again and the 80s and even
Yeah,
before,
definitely.
like the reason why the idea of the welfare state lost a lot of influence was plain old racism.
Oh, oh yeah.
Like people
Welfare queen.
didn't,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. People didn't like the idea of paying black people who didn't work
Yeah.
money,
Stay at
basically.
home.
And you see the same attitude today towards
Yes.
poor people in Appalachia, but now it's mainly like coastal elites and like enlightened liberals who think that those Trump voting sons of bitches, I'm not gonna pay them welfare.
Yeah.
Like this is it's a common joke if you watch like online or TV news commentary comedy shows like what's called the Daily Show and stuff like that. They love to bring up the fact that red states take out more than they contribute to the federal budget.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's basically the same argument.
Mm.
It's like a stupid elitist argument used against exploited poor people,
Mm.
no matter if they're white or black,
Mm.
and it's kind of despicable actually to
Yeah.
argue about like people's right to a decent life in
Yeah.
those terms. And those who make those jokes should probably be ashamed of themselves,
Yeah.
if you ask
I
me.
think attitudes are changing, not least because of COVID, because everybody's on welfare, getting these direct checks, and nobody's when ordinary middle class, working class, hardworking families are dependent on these and unemployment benefits, which are not enough in America the way the system works, but the ones coming from the federal government, which unfortunately are they're running out. But you know, people's attitudes are changing. On the other hand, it seemed, I mean, if we go back a few weeks, I think we were more optimistic, or I was more optimistic about this. But now you're starting to see pushback from Republicans who are making, I mean, the argument that I remember growing up that in this case, the payments, unemployment and $1,400 checks and stuff, these are keeping people away from work. And you have a so-called labor shortage, which we won't go into now because it's a topic in itself. But they're making this argument. I find it is so insidious, you know, because we're still in the middle of a crisis. And they're saying, well, people can go back to work now, and they're not doing it because they're making more money on unemployment. And that was a whole argument in the, well, as you say, with Ronald Reagan. And I hope this argument doesn't take hold, because the other argument, which we have been living with, is, hey, we need this money to survive.
Yeah.
And that should be the basis of anybody's thinking about this issue. But the Republicans, you know, and these are state governors too, of course, who don't want to pay out this money, Republican governors, and say, no, we're not going to pay you any more unemployment benefits. Go to work instead.
Yeah, and like we have the same sentiment here in Sweden today as well. Like over the last 30 years, Sweden has moved quite far to the right on economic issues. But I mean, I refer those people complaining about that to the answer the Swedish Social Democrats gave in the 70s. If you want people to work, pay them more money. And yeah, if you can't pay people a wage they're willing to work for, then maybe you don't deserve to have a business.
I'm just wondering about time. I think we're coming up on another hour again. How do you want to round this off?
I don't know. It's is there any cause for hope? Will things get better?
Oh, that's right. I put that on as one of the words. Yeah. Well, what do you think? I think there is.
I do too, actually. I think there's like a higher level of awareness today than 20 years ago or 50 years ago, and I think there's going to be more education on the matter, and there's going to be more like local organizing, and demands are going to be made. And, hopefully met. So I have kind of like a positive positive vibe. I've been reading a lot about Appalachia in the news lately, and that's a good sign, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think so too. It's very easy to be depressed about certain things, and again, the extent of the problem. But I think so too. And in a way, it's just sort of, you know, you had the 30s, you had the 60s, and now you have the economic consequences of COVID and so forth, which I think are, again, are changing people's minds. People outside of Appalachia, I want my $1,400 and so forth. And also, I think within the region, there's lots of interesting initiatives, local initiatives, and also an interest on the part of universities in the non-Appalachian parts of, say, Virginia and so forth. Because I think that's important to see. I have a problem with regional development, because if you cut this area off from the states that they're really a part of, I think you miss something. But I think there's a change in attitude and amongst people living in Appalachia, and people living outside of it, and an awareness that, you know, economic recovery requires everybody to to be involved, just like, again, the 30s especially, and then to perhaps a somewhat lesser extent in the 1960s. So we're living in that type of era where progressive change is, yeah, and you see things actually being done, even by Joe Biden.
Yeah, and I think Joe Biden's political project is it's gonna make it easier to argue for progressive politics in general in Appalachia, because like his support of unions, that
Yes.
has to play well in Appalachia.
Yeah.
And all the comparisons to FDR and the New Deal and LBJ and stuff like that. I mean, even if it doesn't clear that bar, I think the mere fact that people are talking in those terms
Yes.
are going to benefit the Democrats enormously in the
Yeah.
region. And like I'm hopeful that maybe not in 2 years or 3 years rather, but in like 1 or 2 cycles, we might see Appalachian states switching political allegiance again, because we never got into that, but it has like a really interesting history.
I know we'll have to do that sometime. We'll get into it, but because like West Virginia, which is a now, as they say, it's a Republican state. I had a Republican governor who wanted to have a $15 minimum wage, and Joe Manchin, the Democrat, says no. But there's a lot of local. It's declining, but still a lot of local offices are held by Democrats. So not the statewide and not on the federal level now, but well, Joe Manchin. But I mean, there's cause for optimism, and there's a place where things can, what am I trying? Yeah, grassroots organizations to grow. So, and West Virginia, another thing was talk about the primary, Democratic primary, 1960, the Kennedy one. I mean, and then it was really a Democratic state, and. No, if you focus on local, and this goes beyond Appalachia, but focus on local issues, what does your community need? This is what we can do. And I know Democrats are doing this in very many places, just that the Democratic label has sort of gotten a bad name in the past 20 years. Yeah. But you can turn the tide. And then in other states like Kentucky, the Democratic governor, lieutenant governor, if they had chosen a better candidate against Mitch McConnell, maybe this person, I forget the guy's name, maybe he wouldn't have won. But the person they put up against him, well, why even do that? Just have a walkover like in sports,
Yeah.
So, and Pennsylvania is another interesting area. North Carolina voted for Obama twice, and swing states. Georgia, part of which is Appalachia, in fact. So yeah, there's, again, maybe not right now in the midterms, but there's a process, a longer term process, and which would definitely benefit the people of Appalachia if the Democrats got back in there and did what they did in the 60s and in the 1930s. Your internet connection is unstable. I think we're going to break pretty soon.
Cutting in and out, but maybe we should just leave it at that. There's definitely hope for progressive politics in Appalachia, and I think just like generally, the future has to be better than what's come before. I genuinely think there's cause for optimism. A lot of hurdles to overcome, though. It's gonna take some time to repair the damage done from like 1880.
If we look at the past that you described and the labor wars and everything, maybe, I mean, change does come, and Okay, I'm going to stop before the whole thing collapses. So thank you, Anders, for another interesting conversation and your detailed knowledge of labor history in Appalachia.
Thank you.
That was really good. Definitely, we covered so much. Of course, now we have 2 recordings. So yeah, thanks. And thanks for people listening and watching. You have a really solid basic course in Appalachia history and yeah, uh, economically and I'm going to stop talking. It was a really good discussion. We both enjoy doing this because of our individual and shared interest in the region. So I'm going to see if I can press the right button this time and stop recording. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank people. Goodbye. I will now stop recording.